The war is not over. The guns have not gone silent. But already, before the rubble has been cleared, before the diplomats have agreed on what to call what just happened, the world is reorganizing itself around a new set of facts. Wars do not just destroy, they reveal. And what this one has revealed about the distribution of power in the 21st century is something that neither Washington nor Beijing is saying out loud, because saying it out loud would require admitting things that neither capital is prepared to admit. The Iran war lasted 47 days in its most intense phase. It ended not with a treaty, but with an exhausted pause, an uneasy ceasefire that both sides have already violated in the weeks since it was announced. The missiles have largely stopped. The naval blockade continues. The diplomats are meeting in hotel lobbies in Islamabad and Istanbul, saying things that contradict what other diplomats said hours earlier. Nobody has won, nobody has lost. And that ambiguity is precisely the point, because the war was never really about Iran. To understand what actually happened, you have to look past the immediate battlefield and ask a different question. Not who fired what at whom, but who needed this war, who benefited from it, who was watching it most carefully from a distance, and what conclusions they are now drawing. Because every major power on Earth spent the last 47 days running calculations that had nothing to do with Iranian nuclear sites or Strait of Hormuz shipping lanes. They were calculating something far more important. They were calculating whether American power still means what it used to mean. That question has been building for decades. It did not begin with this war. It began with Iraq, with Afghanistan, with the 2008 financial crisis, with the slow erosion of the institutional architecture that the United States built after 1945 and then gradually stopped believing in itself. Each of those moments chipped something away, but this war accelerated the process in ways that a decade of gradual decline could not, because this time, the limits of American power were not merely visible. They were measurable. They were counted in intercepted missiles and redirected tankers and the number of days it took for peace talks to collapse in Islamabad before anyone had even agreed on an agenda. Begin with what the United States achieved. The strikes degraded significant portions of Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Key facilities were damaged, some severely. The Iranian air defense network, formidable on paper, performed well below expectations against the combined weight of American and Israeli precision munitions. The naval blockade strangled Iranian port traffic and imposed real economic costs in a very short time. By the narrow metrics of a military campaign, the United States demonstrated capabilities that no other nation on Earth can match. The ability to project that kind of force from that distance with that precision remains singular. Nobody serious disputes this. But here is what almost nobody was paying attention to in the early weeks of the campaign. The missile stockpiles were depleting faster than anyone had publicly acknowledged. The logistics of sustaining high-tempo strike operations in that theater strained supply chains that had already been hollowed out by a decade of budget pressures and the demands of supplying Ukraine. The carrier groups were where they needed to be, but the depth of the magazine, the actual inventory of precision munitions that could be sustained over a prolonged campaign, revealed a gap between American military power as it is perceived and American military power as it actually exists in the real world of industrial capacity and defense procurement timelines. The gap was not catastrophic. It was not even necessarily surprising to those who study these things, but it was visible. And in geopolitics, visibility changes everything. China saw it. Russia saw it. Every government in the Middle East saw it. Every defense ministry in Asia saw it. And what they saw was not the collapse of American military primacy. It was something more precise and therefore more consequential. They saw the ceiling, and once you have seen the ceiling, you begin to plan accordingly. Beijing spent the 47 days of this war doing something that attracted almost no attention in Western media because Western media was focused on the daily drama of strikes and counterstrikes and collapsing peace talks. China was positioning, quietly, methodically, with the patience of a state that thinks in decades rather than news cycles. It called for restraint. It expressed concern about humanitarian conditions. It offered to mediate. It said all the correct diplomatic things while simultaneously doing something else entirely. It was deepening its relationships across the Middle East, offering reconstruction financing, expanding its diplomatic footprint in countries that were watching the American performance and drawing their own conclusions. And in the background, barely noticed, it was moving the pieces of its critical mineral supply chain into positions that would matter enormously in whatever world came next. The gallium dimension of this story deserves far more attention than it has received. Gallium is the metal that makes modern semiconductors function. Without it, the precision guidance systems in the munitions that were fired during this war cannot be built. China controls 99% of global gallium production. It banned exports to the United States in late 2024, and as the war revealed the pace at which precision munitions are consumed in a modern high-intensity conflict, every defense planner in Washington quietly updated their threat assessment to include a vulnerability that goes far deeper than Iranian missiles or Chinese warships. It is the vulnerability of a military superpower whose most sophisticated weapons depend on a supply chain that runs directly through the territory of its primary strategic competitor. That is not a tactical problem, it is a structural one, and it does not get solved in 47 days or 47 months. Russia, meanwhile, was doing what Russia has become expert at doing in the era of Western distraction. It was advancing, not dramatically, not in the sweeping operational movements that military strategists write about, but steadily, methodically, grinding forward in Ukraine while the strategic bandwidth of the Trump administration was consumed entirely by the drama in the Middle East. The peace talks in Ukraine, already frozen, became colder still. The EU loan to Kyiv was blocked. Ukrainian government reserves were projected to run out by May, and Russia's oil revenues, initially hurt by Ukrainian drone strikes on export terminals, were partially offset by the global oil price spike that the Iran war itself produced. Moscow did not need to do anything clever. It simply needed the world to look elsewhere, and the world obliged. And that's when everything shifted, because the ceasefire, when it came, did not produce the resolution that military campaigns are supposed to produce. Iran's nuclear program was damaged but not destroyed. The knowledge exists, the engineers exist, the political will to rebuild exists and has been hardened rather than softened by what happened. A country that felt itself under existential attack does not emerge from that experience concluding that it should be more compliant with outside demands. It emerges concluding that the capability it was attacked for was correct to pursue and must be rebuilt as quickly and as quietly as possible. The lesson of the war, from Tehran's perspective, is not that nuclear ambitions are too dangerous. It is that they were not advanced far enough, fast enough. What happened next wasn't just unexpected, it changed the entire calculation. The ceasefire produced a vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped not the United States, not any Western power, but a constellation of middle powers and regional actors who had been quietly building influence throughout the conflict. Pakistan, whose mediation had been the primary channel for whatever communication existed between Washington and Tehran, emerged with a diplomatic profile that bore no resemblance to the struggling, internally divided state that Western analysts had been writing crisis reports about for years. Turkey deepened its position as an indispensable back channel. The Gulf states, particularly the UAE and Qatar, accelerated their hedging strategies, maintaining relationships with both Washington and Beijing with a confidence that would have seemed premature 5 years ago. The post-American Middle East, which had been a theoretical concept in foreign policy journals, was beginning to take on an actual geography. The deeper transformation is structural, and it is happening in the architecture of global trade and finance. The Iran war administered a severe shock to the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which approximately 20% of the world's oil passes. The blockade, the mine threats, the insurance premium spikes, the rerouting of tankers. All of it collectively accelerated a calculation that every energy importing nation had been running in the background for years. The calculation is simple. Dependence on a single choke point that can be closed by conflict is not a viable long-term energy strategy. The answer to that calculation is not simply to find alternative routes, it is to find alternative systems, and those alternative systems, pipeline networks, overland routes, new energy partnerships, run overwhelmingly in directions that benefit China and Russia rather than the United States. The Russia-Iran North-South corridor, long discussed and slowly developed, suddenly looks less like a sanctions evasion project and more like the spine of a parallel economic architecture that does not require American approval to function. Consider what that means concretely. The dollar's role as the world's reserve currency is not guaranteed by American values or American institutions. It is guaranteed by the fact that most of the world's critical trade, oil above all, is denominated in dollars. When the systems through which that trade flows begin to fracture, when alternative corridors emerge that are denominated in other currencies and insured by other institutions, the foundation of dollar dominance begins to shift. Not quickly, not catastrophically, but perceptibly. And perceptions in financial systems have a way of becoming self-fulfilling. There are several trajectories from here, and none of them are simple. In the first, the United States absorbs the lessons of this war and responds with strategic discipline, rebuilding missile stockpiles, investing in domestic gallium and critical mineral production, maintaining alliance commitments in Europe while managing the Middle East with a lighter and more sustainable footprint. This trajectory is possible. It requires political will that the current environment makes difficult to sustain, but the institutional capacity exists. America has surprised the world before by finding reserves of strategic discipline that its political dysfunction seemed to preclude. In the second trajectory, the exhaustion produced by this war deepens the retrenchment that was already underway. The political system, overwhelmed by the domestic costs of the conflict, turns further inward. Allies in Asia who were already uncertain about American commitment become more uncertain. Beijing reads the uncertainty correctly and accelerates its timeline in the South China Sea and toward Taiwan. The third trajectory is the most dangerous and the least discussed. It is the one in which neither Washington nor Beijing intends to escalate, but both are operating in a world where the rules that previously managed their competition have been quietly discarded, and where the next crisis, wherever it occurs, over whatever immediate cause, finds both powers without the guardrails that prevented miscalculation in the previous era. The Iran War did not begin the US-China rivalry. It did not fundamentally alter the underlying balance of power between two states whose combined economic and military weight dwarfs every other actor in the system. But it did something more subtle, and perhaps more lasting. It ran a live test of American power under real conditions, in real time, watched by every government on Earth. And the results of that test, not the headline results, not the damage assessments released by Central Command, but the deeper results about logistics and sustainability and alliance management and the willingness of partners to follow American leadership into costly confrontations, those results are being studied right now in capitals from Beijing to Brasilia, from Riyadh to Jakarta. The world that emerges from this war is not a post-American world. American power remains the most formidable single concentration of military and economic capability on the planet. But it is a world in which American primacy is increasingly understood as conditional rather than absolute, conditioned on decisions that have not yet been made, sustained by institutions that are under strain, dependent on alliances whose depth is uncertain, and constrained by a domestic political environment that makes long-term strategic consistency genuinely difficult to maintain. That is a different kind of world than the one that existed on September 12, 2001. It is a different kind of world than the one that existed in 2011 or even 2019. History does not announce its turning points. It does not pause to let the participants understand what has just changed. The men and women making decisions in Washington and Beijing and Tehran and Kyiv and Islamabad today are operating in the fog of a transition they can feel but not yet fully see. The structures of the old order are still standing. The institutions still meet. The alliances still hold, mostly. But something has shifted in the underlying logic of how power works and who has it and what it can accomplish. The ceasefire will hold, or it will not. The negotiations in Islamabad will produce something, or they will not. Iran will rebuild, or it will be prevented from doing so, or it will find a way to do both simultaneously. None of that is the real story. The real story is the world watching and learning and recalculating. And in that recalculation lies the shape of what comes next. Not a sudden rupture, not a clean break with the past, but a slow and irreversible rearrangement of who defers to whom and why and for how long. The post-Iran war world order is not being written in peace treaties. It is being written in the supply chains being rerouted, in the currencies being quietly diversified away from, in the defense budgets being revised upward from Tokyo to Warsaw, in the diplomatic relationships being deepened between capitals that would have seemed unlikely partners a decade ago. It is being written in the gallium stockpiles and the missile inventories and the insurance maps that now show the Persian Gulf in a different color than they did 6 months ago. History moves slowly until it does not. And there are moments, rare, unmistakable in retrospect if not always in real time, when the accumulation of small shifts reaches a threshold and the map of the world looks different than it did before. Whether this is one of those moments will not be known for years, but the governments that are acting as though it is will be better positioned than the ones that are waiting to find out.